The city skyline stretched out behind the glass, a grid of light and ambition that Marcus Thorne treated as his private property. He stood at the center of the office, his back to the door, perfectly still. He did not turn when the heavy handle clicked. He did not look up when the footsteps stopped on the polished floor. I stood there, my fingers digging into the edges of a cardboard box. It held 12 years of my life. A few pens, a notebook, the accumulated weight of a decade spent building his foundation. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy enough to feel against the skin. Then, Marcus shifted. He did not pivot. He simply tilted his head, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the city in the glass. His voice cut through the air, thin and sharp as a razor. "Elias," he said, the name sounding like an afterthought. "The board demands efficiency. You are a relic. Security will escort you out. Do not make a scene." He didn't even acknowledge my presence as a human being. He simply turned back to the window, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the horizon. The word hung in the air, vibrating with a clinical finality. Relic. It was not an insult. It was a classification. He had reduced 12 years of code, sleepless nights, and strategic victories to a piece of obsolete hardware. I looked down at the box in my hands. The cardboard felt flimsy, the edges biting into my palms as I gripped it tighter. Around me, the office was a masterpiece of glass and steel, designed to make anyone who didn't own it feel small. I was smaller than small. I was invisible. I watched the back of his head, the way he adjusted his cuffs with a slow, deliberate motion. My pulse thudded in my ears, a rhythmic, angry beat that seemed to be the only thing keeping me upright. Every piece of equipment I had maintained, every system I had optimized, was now someone else's property. I was being scrubbed from history. I turned toward the door, my movements stiff, feeling the weight of the box pull at my shoulders, dragging me toward the hallway. I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing against the polished marble of the hallway. The security guards stood by the elevators, their eyes fixed on the cardboard box in my arms. They were waiting for me to stumble, to protest, to give them a reason to be forceful. I did not give them that satisfaction. My hand moved inside my coat, fingers brushing against the cold, hard plastic of the server room keycard. It was still pressed firmly against my palm, a secret weight hidden in the lining of the fabric. He thought he was deleting a file. He had no idea he was inviting a virus into the very foundation of his empire. I was not leaving empty-handed. I was carrying the master key to his kingdom, a silent seed of rebellion. I reached the lobby, the glass doors looming ahead, and stepped out into the cool air of the alley. The alley was narrow, choked with the smell of wet cardboard and city exhaust. I moved past the main entrance, keeping my head down, blending into the shadows of the loading docks. My target was tucked behind a stack of discarded shipping crates, a heavy steel plate that had been painted over a dozen times. I knelt, the grit of the pavement digging into my knees. The maintenance hatch had been sealed since 1994, its edges fused with decades of grime and oxidation. I wedged the edge of my keycard into the seam, then grabbed a discarded iron pipe from the debris. I jammed it into the gap and leaned my entire weight against the metal. It groaned, a high-pitched screech of protesting steel that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet alley. I held my breath, listening for footsteps, for security, for any sign that I had been spotted. Nothing. I pushed again, harder, until the seal snapped with a violent crack. The hatch swung outward, revealing a dark, yawning throat of concrete and shadow. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the pipe, gripped the edge of the opening, and swung my legs into the void. The air inside was cold, thick with the scent of stagnant water and copper. I pulled the hatch shut behind me, plunging the world into absolute, suffocating blackness. I crawled forward, my hands scraping against rough, damp concrete. The space was a labyrinth of rusted pipes that groaned under the pressure of the city above. Every few feet, a massive transformer hummed, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. I followed the low-frequency thrum of the primary HVAC unit. Behind the main housing, the wall felt different. I pressed my palm against the surface and felt a hollow vibration. I pushed, and a section of the partition gave way, sliding on hidden tracks. I squeezed through the narrow gap and found myself in a 12 by 12 concrete vault. It was silent here, shielded from the roar of the fans. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust and ancient stone. I stood up, my head nearly brushing the low ceiling, and swept my hand across the walls. This was a dead zone, a forgotten pocket of architecture. I dropped my box on the floor and listened to the echo. Outside, the building continued its frantic pace, unaware that a ghost had just moved into its basement. I was no longer a man without a home. I was the architect of the shadows, and this concrete box was my new command center. The vault became my world. I scavenged discarded server foam from the maintenance corridors, dragging the dense synthetic blocks into the vault to form a makeshift bed. It was rigid and smelled of burnt plastic, but it kept me off the freezing concrete floor. I spent the first few days mapping the ventilation shafts, feeling the subtle shifts in airflow that signaled the building's massive lungs. The air here was different. It was sharp, biting, and tasted constantly of ozone and static, a byproduct of the high-voltage transformers humming just inches beyond my wall. My lungs adjusted to the thin, metallic atmosphere. I learned to ignore the constant, low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth whenever the cooling system spiked. I organized my few belongings along the base of the wall, creating a perimeter of wires and salvage tools. Every night, I watched the blue and green LEDs of my rogue servers flicker in the dark, casting long, rhythmic shadows against the concrete. They were the only stars I had now. I didn't need sunlight. I didn't need the city above. I had the hum of the machines and the cold, steady grip of the dark. I was no longer just hiding. I was becoming part of the infrastructure itself, breathing in the static and waiting for the right moment to strike. I began to map the pulse of the building, not through blueprints, but through the sound of heels on marble and the click of heavy locks. I spent hours pressed against the ventilation grate, counting the seconds between the 2 a.m. cleaning crew's arrival and their departure. They were predictable, moving in a tight formation that left the service corridor empty for exactly 90 seconds. I timed the 3:15 a.m. security shift change with a stopwatch I had cobbled together from salvaged circuit boards. The guards were exhausted, their footsteps dragging as they swapped keys and grumbled about the late hour. During that transition, the hallway went dead. No cameras panned, no radios crackled. It was a window of absolute stillness. I practiced my movement, timing my exit from the vault to the second. I learned the exact pressure required to turn a handle without a click. I memorized the creak of every floorboard in the service wing. By the end of the month, I was a ghost in their machine, moving through the facility with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. The fiber optic trunk was the building's nervous system, a thick, armored cable running behind the main transformer. I found the access point during a routine sweep, hidden behind a heavy steel plate that required a custom-ground pry bar to shift. I spent 3 nights filing the metal until it gave way without a sound. Inside, the light pulses were visible, a faint, rhythmic glow bleeding through the glass fibers. I pulled out my splicing kit, my hands steady despite the cramped, suffocating space. I stripped back the protective sheath, exposing the delicate glass core. It was fragile. A single wrong move would sever the connection and trigger an immediate alarm in the server room above. I held my breath, the only sound in the vault being the frantic thud of my own heart. I carefully aligned the signal injector, feeling the resistance of the glass as it clicked into place. The connection established instantly. My laptop screen flared to life, a cascade of raw data flooding the monitor. I was no longer just a tenant in the walls. I was the administrator of the entire facility. I rerouted the traffic, creating a hidden tunnel that bypassed the primary firewalls. I began dragging salvaged components into the vault, one piece at a time. I built the frames from discarded server foam and heavy-duty zip ties, stacking them against the concrete walls. I scavenged power from the HVAC lines, stripping wires and twisting copper until the load was balanced. The first time I flipped the main switch, the entire vault groaned. The lights in the corridor dimmed. I held my breath, listening for the heavy tread of security boots, but the hum of the cooling fans leveled out. I watched as the first rogue server initialized, its status lights blinking a steady, rhythmic blue. Soon, the entire wall was alive with a constellation of green and amber LEDs casting long, sharp shadows. I sat back on my foam bed, watching the data streams dance across my screens, the architecture of my vengeance. With the network stable, I turned my attention to the corporate ledger. Thorntech was a bloated beast. Its financial infrastructure, a tangled mess of legacy code and inefficient cloud compute contracts. I began by scanning the outgoing traffic, identifying the massive automated payments for high-end GPU clusters. These were the lifeblood of the company's research division. I wrote a script to intercept these requests, siphoning a fraction of the processing power into my own hidden nodes. The first attempt triggered a red flag in the system logs. My screen flashed a warning, a digital siren screaming in silence. I had 3 seconds before the automated security protocol locked the port. I slammed my fingers against the keys, injecting a spoofed authorization token. The system accepted the redirection as a routine load balancing update. I watched the data flow, a steady stream of stolen cycles pouring into my vault. I was now consuming the very resources Thorne used to build his future, turning his own infrastructure against him. I leaned back and felt the power shift. I pushed the siphon further. I didn't just want processing power. I wanted their capital. I targeted the cloud compute budget, a bottomless pit of corporate spending where money vanished into redundant service agreements. I rerouted $1 million in GPU shipments and licensing fees directly into my own shell accounts. The moment the transfer hit, the central ledger flagged the anomaly. A red notification pulsed on my monitor, indicating a critical variance in the quarterly projections. I held my breath, watching the internal messaging system. A senior accountant in the finance department opened the file, his cursor hovering over the discrepancy. I waited for the alarm, for the security team to descend into the basement. Instead, the accountant typed a single comment into the log. Consolidate with Q3 overhead. He marked it as a rounding error and closed the tab. The system returned to its baseline hum. Thorntech was so bloated, so saturated with excess, that $1 million was invisible to them. I leaned back in the dark, a thin smile forming as I realized the scale of their neglect. They were not just losing money, they were funding their own destruction. I needed more than just raw compute power. I needed a network that could survive a total system reboot. My vault was a fortress, but it was isolated. I began scanning the building's internal network for weak points. I found them in the most mundane places. Every floor of Thorntech was equipped with smart thermostats and networked office printers. These devices were the perfect camouflage. They were always on, always connected, and never monitored by the security team. I started small. I accessed the firmware of a printer on the 4th floor, injecting a tiny, dormant payload into its print spooling service. It worked instantly. The printer continued to function, but it was now a node in my private web. I moved to the climate control systems, embedding my code into the sensors that regulated the office temperature. I turned the building's own infrastructure into a sprawling, decentralized server farm. If Thorne searched for a rogue computer, he would find nothing but a printer and a thermostat. I was the glitch that never got fixed. I was no longer just hiding. I was becoming part of the building's logic. I wrote a self-replicating script that lived in the background of the HVAC controllers, a ghost process that monitored its own integrity. Every time the central server ran an automated diagnostic sweep, my code would fragment, hide in the printer cache, and reassemble once the scan passed. It was a digital shell game that never ended. I watched the system logs from my vault, seeing the diagnostic reports come back clean, time after time. Thorne's security software saw my activity as a minor firmware quirk, a harmless bit of data noise that the system simply ignored. I had achieved the impossible. I was a permanent, unfixable error in a world that demanded perfection. I spent my hours refining the connections, ensuring that even if a single printer was unplugged, the network would reroute through the smart lighting grid. I was the shadow in the wiring, the silent architect of a system that no longer belonged to its owner. I sat in the dark, watching the green status lights blink in perfect harmony. With the network under my control, I began to tighten the noose. I didn't need to destroy the company, I only needed to make it bleed. I targeted the communication channels that Marcus relied on for his daily operations. I intercepted his outgoing emails, holding them in a buffer for exactly 3 minutes before releasing them into the wild. It was a subtle, invisible delay, but in the world of high-frequency trading, 3 minutes is an eternity. I watched the Tokyo Exchange data on my monitors, tracking the movement of his capital. When he sent an order to execute a trade, my script would catch the packet, stall the transmission, and then let it pass. By the time the message reached the exchange, the market price had shifted. I watched the loss accumulate in real time. A few $1,000s here, 100,000 there. It was a slow, steady drain that looked like nothing more than bad luck or network latency. I saw Marcus through the hidden camera in his office, slamming his fist onto his desk as he stared at his screen. He refreshed the page, cursed at his connection, and called his brokers to demand answers. I sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of his frustration through the vents. He was losing his grip on his empire, and he didn't even know his own infrastructure was the one pulling the rug out from under him. Financial loss was only the beginning. I wanted to control his physical reality. I turned my attention to his smart car, a machine that was essentially a rolling computer on wheels. It was connected to the same network I had already compromised. I bypassed the vehicle's security encryption, gaining direct access to the engine control unit and the braking system. I waited for the moment he left the office. Tracking his progress through the city's traffic sensors, he entered the Midtown Tunnel at exactly 6 p.m. I initiated the override. I flooded the car's internal bus with junk data, forcing the engine to cut power while locking the electronic steering. The car didn't just stop. It died in the middle of the dark, narrow passage. I watched the live feed from the car's internal cameras. The cabin lights flickered and went black. Marcus hit the steering wheel, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard warning icons. He was trapped in a metal box, miles from his office, completely at the mercy of a ghost he couldn't see. The tunnel incident was a success, but I needed more than just his location. I needed his pulse. I pivoted my access to his biometric health tracker, a device he wore to monitor his own performance and stress levels. It was a goldmine of raw, unfiltered data. I watched the live feed on my monitor as his heart rate climbed from a steady resting pace to a frantic, erratic rhythm. The spikes were perfect. Every time I triggered a minor system error in his home or office, the data reflected his internal state with surgical precision. I saw his heart rate jump when his smart lights flickered in the middle of the night, and I watched it accelerate when his digital calendar began deleting his morning appointments. He was living in a state of constant, low-grade adrenaline, and I was the one holding the throttle. I kept the data stream open, watching the jagged lines on my screen as he paced his office, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that only I could see. I sat in the dark, my own pulse steady, watching his life unravel one heartbeat at a time. He was terrified, and the data proved it. I was no longer the man who had been escorted out of the building with a cardboard box. That version of me had died in the alleyway 3 years ago. Watching the biometric data, I realized the shift was complete. I had moved beyond simple sabotage. I was now the architect of his internal landscape, constructing a reality where every shadow held a threat and every silence felt like a trap. I watched him sit at his desk, staring at a screen that showed no errors, yet his hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He was looking for a ghost in the machine, unaware that the ghost was sitting in the walls beneath him. I could see the exact moment he began to question his own perception. He would stare at the walls, his eyes darting toward the corners, searching for a surveillance device that did not exist. He was tearing his own confidence apart, piece by piece, fueled by the invisible pressure I applied to his life. I was the glitch that never got fixed. The static in his signal, the architect of a paranoia that was now his only constant companion. I held the keys to his sanity. I toggled the feed from the hidden cameras embedded in the office ceiling. The high-definition display flickered to life, showing Marcus Thorne standing in the center of the room. He was not alone. 3 security personnel stood before him, their faces pale and rigid. Thorne was shouting, his finger jabbing at the air, his face flushed with a deep, frantic red. He gestured wildly toward the empty walls, his movements erratic and sharp. One of the guards stepped forward to speak, but Thorne shoved him back, his voice rising to a jagged, broken pitch. I watched the security team exchange glances, their eyes wide with disbelief and fear. They were looking at a man who had lost his grip on the physical world. Thorne grabbed a heavy glass of wort from his desk and hurled it against the mahogany paneling. It shattered into a dozen pieces, yet he did not stop. He paced the length of the office, his head snapping toward every corner as if he could see through the drywall. He was screaming orders that made no sense, demanding they find a threat that existed only in his own mind. I leaned back in my chair, watching the chaos unfold in real time. The empire was tearing itself apart from the inside, and I was the only witness to the collapse. Thorne stopped shouting and grabbed his radio. He ordered a full structural sweep of the entire executive floor. Within minutes, maintenance crews arrived with thermal scanners and acoustic sensors. I watched from the dark as they peeled back the wallpaper. Thorne stood in the center of the room, his eyes wild, pacing the perimeter of the carpet. He was not satisfied with their progress. He snatched a sledgehammer from a bewildered technician and swung it into the mahogany paneling of his own wall. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. He swung again and again, tearing through the plaster and insulation until the steel studs were exposed. He was hunting for a ghost. He crawled on his hands and knees, pressing his ear against the concrete floor, listening for the hum of my servers. He was inches away. The floorboards beneath his palms were the only thing separating us. He stood up, breathing hard, his hands covered in dust and drywall debris. He looked at the wreckage of his office, convinced he was closing in on the intruder. He had no idea that the foundation he was tearing apart was already mine. While Thorne tore his office apart above, I began the final harvest. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking the only sound in my concrete vault. I initiated the script I had spent months refining. It crawled through the hidden partitions of the ThorneTech network, pulling data from encrypted subfolders that even the board of directors never accessed. I watched the progress bars fill on my monitors. One by one, the files materialized: private correspondence, offshore account logs, and recordings of board meetings held in the dead of night. I hit a wall, a triple-layered encryption protocol designed to lock out external intrusion. I paused, my breath hitching, and input the override sequence I had harvested from his own smart device traffic weeks prior. The barrier dissolved. The data flowed into my drive, a relentless stream of digital evidence. I organized the files, tagging each one with a timestamp and a location. Every illegal trade, every backroom deal, every instance of corporate sabotage was now indexed. I watched the file size climb, gigabyte by gigabyte, until the entire history of his corruption was contained on a single, encrypted drive. I ejected the drive and held it in my palm. The weight of his entire empire was now in my hand, and the time for observation had finally come to an end. I left the drive connected and opened the subdirectory labeled Retirement Fund Optimization. It was a sterile name for a massacre. I scanned the ledger entries, watching the numbers drain from the employee pension accounts into a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Thorne had not just skimmed the interest, he had gutted the principal. I found the internal memos, signed with his digital authorization, ordering the systematic liquidation of the funds during the previous fiscal quarter. He had bet the life savings of 10,000 employees on a high-risk tech merger that he knew was destined to fail. I pulled up the balance sheets from the day before the crash. The accounts were full. I compared them to the records from the day after. They were hollowed out, leaving nothing but digital dust. I traced the final destination of the stolen capital. It sat in a private account, sitting dormant, waiting for his personal withdrawal. I watched the timestamp on the transfer, 3 a.m. on a Sunday, while the rest of the city slept. I saved the logs, highlighted the signatures, and moved them into the primary folder. This was no longer just about my lost career. It was about the thousands of families he had left with nothing. I shifted my focus to the audio logs, the final piece of the puzzle. I opened a folder labeled Internal Communications and clicked on a file from the previous month. The audio began with the sharp, rhythmic tapping of a pen against the glass desk. Thorne's voice filled the small, damp vault, sounding unnervingly close. He was speaking to a consultant, his tone dripping with a casual, predatory disdain. "They are not people, they are overhead," he said, followed by a dry, humorless laugh. He went on to describe the staff as biological machinery, easily replaced and entirely disposable. I skipped to another file. This one was from the day of the factory floor accident. Thorne was on the phone with his legal team, complaining about the downtime caused by the worker's injury. He didn't ask about the person's condition, he asked how to minimize the settlement payout. I listened to him mock the victim's family, his words sharp and devoid of any human empathy. The arrogance was absolute. He truly believed he existed on a higher plane than the people who built his empire. I sat in the dark, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my eyes, and saved every second of the audio. The evidence was no longer just numbers on a screen. It was his own voice, condemning him with every syllable. I had everything I needed. 3 years in the belly of the beast had left its mark. My skin had grown pale, bleached by the perpetual dimness of the maintenance tunnels, and my joints protested every movement with a dull, rhythmic ache. I stood up from the foam-padded floor, my spine popping like dry kindling. I walked to the edge of the vault, pressing my palm against the cold, vibrating concrete of the HVAC unit. The hum of the building was my pulse now. I caught my reflection in a darkened server rack. My eyes were sunken, rimmed with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, but the gaze was steady. I had become a creature of the infrastructure, as much a part of the building as the rusted pipes and tangled fiber optic cables. A tremor ran through my left hand, a lingering symptom of the cramped, static-filled air, but I clenched my fist until the knuckles turned white, forcing the nerves to obey. I was no longer the man who had been escorted out of the lobby with a cardboard box. That man had been soft, predictable, and easily discarded. The person standing in this vault was a weapon, forged in the dark and tempered by the very rot that Thorne had allowed to fester. I checked the status of the upload queue one last time. The progress bars were full, waiting for the final trigger. I was ready. The morning of the IPO arrived not with a sunrise, but with a change in the building's frequency. The low, steady hum of the HVAC unit was suddenly overlaid by a sharper, more erratic vibration. Above my head, the floorboards transmitted the frantic rhythm of high-stakes commerce. I pressed my ear to the concrete ceiling and listened. The muffled thud of expensive leather shoes on marble echoed through the vents. There was a frantic, clipped quality to the movement. Thorne Tech was waking up, but it was a nervous, jagged awakening. I could hear the distant, indistinct murmur of voices, the sharp clatter of catering carts. The air in my vault grew heavy, charged with the static of 1,000 digital transactions beginning to queue. I sat back on my makeshift chair, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The contrast was absolute. Above, they were busy polishing a facade of success. Below, I was holding the match to the fuse. The countdown had begun. The lobby had become a staging ground for the inevitable. Through the hidden network of security cameras and smart sensors I had hijacked, I watched them arrive. They moved with the practiced arrogance of men who traded in futures and leveraged debt, their voices echoing off the polished marble walls. They were oblivious. They checked their phones, traded stock tips, and sipped coffee, completely unaware that the very floor they stood upon was a digital minefield. I watched their faces on my monitors, the smug smiles, the hurried glances at watches, the calculated posturing of the financial elite. Every step they took triggered a sensor I had repurposed to track their movements. I saw the data packets of their encrypted devices pinging off the building's internal Wi-Fi, which I had long ago turned into a sieve. They were walking into a trap, their wealth and reputations tethered to a foundation that was already rotting from the inside out. I watched a senior partner adjust his tie, his reflection captured in a glass panel that was currently streaming his private communications directly to my servers. He was a ghost in the machine, and he didn't even know it. The lobby was full now. The trap was primed. Every transaction they initiated was just another thread in the web. I turned my back on the lobby monitors and faced the primary console. The blue light of the screens washed over the concrete walls of my vault. It was time for the final sweep. I initiated the diagnostic sequence, watching the lines of code scroll past at a speed that would have blinded a normal operator. Everything had to be perfect. A red warning light flickered on the secondary server rack. A packet collision in the routing layer. My heart rate didn't spike. It slowed. I tapped the override command, rerouting the traffic through the building's smart thermostat network. The red light blinked out, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of green. I checked the file integrity for the third time. The surveillance logs, the offshore transfers, the internal memos detailing the pension fund theft. It was all there, compressed and ready to bloom. I ran a final ping to the Times Square ticker feed. The connection was solid. The latency was 0. I looked at the progress bar. 99%. The system was breathing, waiting for the signal to exhale. I leaned in, my breath fogging the edge of the glass monitor. The machine was ready. The ghost in the foundation was finally prepared to speak. I sat in the center of the vault, the air thick with the hum of cooling fans. My finger hovered inches above the interface. 12 years of being a ghost. 3 years of living in the dark, feeding on the scraps of an empire that had discarded me. The weight of it pressed against my chest, a physical pressure that made every breath feel heavy. Above me, the building groaned, a deep metallic shiver that traveled down the conduit pipes and vibrated through the floor. It was the sound of 1,000 people moving in unison, unaware that their world was about to tilt. I looked at the screen. The cursor blinked, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the center of the darkness. I thought of the office, the cold voice, the dismissal. My hand was steady. I didn't feel rage anymore. I felt the cold, sharp clarity of a scalpel. The vibration returned, stronger this time. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the pulse of the network. I pushed my finger forward, the final contact point. 60 floors above my vault, the air was filled with the clink of crystal and the low murmur of anticipation. Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the boardroom, his gaze fixed on the panoramic view of the city. He held a glass of amber liquid, tilting it toward the morning light that flooded the office. The room was packed with investors, their faces bright with the promise of the upcoming IPO. Thorne didn't look at the screens. He looked at the horizon, his posture rigid with the certainty of a man who had already won. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, the sharp chime silencing the room. He began to speak, his voice echoing against the glass walls. He gestured toward the city, claiming the skyline as his own personal asset. He was talking about legacy, about the future. He raised his glass for a final toast, his eyes gleaming with the arrogance of a king who had never once looked down. The Thorne Tech logo flickered on the primary display, a static image of corporate dominance. Then, the code began to purge. Lines of proprietary software dissolved into raw, unformatted text as my script tore through the root directories. A red warning box pulsed in the corner of my monitor, demanding authentication for the final firewall breach. I didn't hesitate. I keyed in the bypass, a sequence of commands I had spent 3 years perfecting in the dark. The warning light turned amber, then green. The system groaned under the weight of the incoming data. I watched the progress bar crawl toward completion. At 99%, the screen went black. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the cooling fans spinning at maximum speed. Then, the display surged with light. The Thorne Tech branding vanished, replaced by the sharp, black silhouette of the Vanguard Raven. It sat centered on the interface, a digital predator. Every internal terminal in the building synchronized, the Raven spreading across the screens. The network was no longer his. It was a mirror, a weapon, and a tomb. The vault was a tomb of silence. Only the hum of the cooling fans broke the stillness, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated through the concrete walls. I sat motionless, my eyes locked on the Raven glowing on my monitor. It was a sharp, predatory shape, a digital mark of ownership that had finally eclipsed the Thorne Tech identity. Above me, the building groaned. It was a deep, structural sound, the kind of noise a massive machine makes when its gears begin to grind against each other. I felt the vibration through my chair, a subtle tremor that traveled down from the executive floor. Somewhere far above, a glass shattered. Then another. The sound was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. The investors were realizing the truth. I reached out and rested my hand on the desk, my fingers tracing the edge of the keyboard. The air in the vault tasted of ozone and stale dust, thick with the weight of 3 years spent in the dark. I took a slow, steady breath. The system was primed. The Raven pulsed once, twice, and then held its light, waiting for my command to end the Empire. My finger hovered over the enter key. It was a simple piece of plastic, yet it held the weight of 12 years of stolen labor and 3 years of calculated vengeance. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and the faces appeared in the dark. The pension holders who lost everything, the engineers whose patents were stripped, the families Thorne discarded like broken hardware. Each name was a line of code in the virus I had built. I didn't just want to win, I wanted to dismantle the very architecture of his arrogance. I pressed down. I didn't click and release. I held it. I felt the resistance of the spring, the mechanical snap against my skin, and I kept the pressure firm. I felt the data packets begin to surge, a digital floodgate opening wide. My heart rate remained steady, a cold, rhythmic beat that matched the flickering of the servers. I was the architect of his collapse, and I was holding the foundation in my hand. The screen turned white, then flooded with the raw, unfiltered truth of Thorne Tech. I kept my finger pressed, feeling the vibration of the servers as they screamed under the load. The Empire was no longer his. It was mine to destroy. The signal traveled through the fiber-optic veins of the city, a silent, unstoppable tide. In the heart of Times Square, the massive digital tickers were mid-cycle, scrolling the projected gains of the Thorne Tech IPO. Then, the glitch hit. The numbers didn't just flicker, they dissolved. The stock prices vanished, replaced by a cascading waterfall of raw, decrypted documents. I watched the feedback loop on my monitor, a live feed of the public reaction. The giant screens erupted in a frantic display of illegal surveillance logs. The crowd below stopped moving. Thousands of heads tilted upward, eyes catching the scrolling text that detailed the systematic rot of the empire. I felt the floor beneath me shudder, a violent tremor that rattled the server racks. Above, the sound of the boardroom panic reached me. The digital truth was now the only reality in the city. Every screen, every billboard, every mobile device connected to the network was broadcasting the same evidence. I pulled my hand back from the keyboard, my work complete. The chaos of the scrolling data began to coalesce into a singular, striking image. Across the massive LED displays, the text stopped its frantic descent. In its place, a sharp, black silhouette emerged. The Raven. It was my signature, a digital mark of the architect who had lived beneath the floorboards for 3 years. It spread with terrifying speed. Every billboard, every kiosk, and every mobile device in the radius of the network flickered once and then locked onto the icon. The Raven was not just a logo, it was a verdict. It stood against the backdrop of the city skyline, a stark ink-black contrast to the bright artificial glow. I watched the live feeds from the streets. People were pointing, their faces illuminated by the dark bird that now dominated the horizon. It was the face of the truth, stripped of the corporate veneer that had hidden it for so long. The Raven didn't move, yet it felt alive, a silent sentinel. It was the final layer of the virus, the visual anchor that ensured no one could look away. Thorne was no longer just losing money, he was losing his legacy. The city was silent, save for the hum of the screens broadcasting my masterpiece. While the city stared at the Raven, the real work was happening in the background. My servers opened a direct, encrypted tunnel to the federal data centers. It was a massive, silent migration of guilt. Millions of files began to stream out of the Thorne Tech mainframe, bypassing every firewall Marcus had spent millions to construct. I watched the progress bars on my terminal, each one representing a piece of his downfall. The FBI servers received the first batch, bank records, offshore accounts, and the hidden ledger of the pension fund theft. Then came the SEC's turn. The data moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, flooding their intake systems, until the bandwidth groaned under the weight of the evidence. There was no way to stop it. I had programmed the packets to be self-replicating and impossible to quarantine. Every time a federal analyst tried to block a connection, the system simply opened 2 more. It was a digital deluge, a relentless torrent of truth that would take years to fully audit. I watched the transfer speed climb, the numbers blurring as the entire history of Thorne Tech was stripped bare and delivered to the authorities. The empire was being dismantled, file by file, in the cold, sterile light of government servers. My finger remained steady, watching the final percentage tick toward completion. The final packet crossed the threshold, and the progress bar vanished. It was done. But the building did not stay silent. Deep within the concrete walls, the HVAC units and the primary power grid began to scream. I had triggered a cascading shutdown of every automated system simultaneously. The smart grid, which I had spent years corrupting, fought back. Motors whined, then seized. Transformers hummed at a frequency that vibrated the very floor beneath my feet. Above me, the massive structure of Thorne Tech groaned. It was not just a digital collapse, it was a mechanical one. The building shuddered, a deep, rhythmic tremor that traveled up through the steel beams. Dust shook loose, raining down like gray snow. I felt the floor tilt, just a fraction of an inch, as the foundation sensors detected the internal failure. It was useless. The sensors were mine. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning insulation. The building was dying, and I was the only one who knew exactly why. The tremor that started in the basement reached the executive floor with violent intent. It was not a subtle shift. The floorboards buckled, and the massive mahogany table in the boardroom groaned under the sudden, uneven pressure. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, as the digital displays on the walls flickered, turned black, and stayed dead. Then came the sound of failure. A single champagne flute, perched on the edge of a marble side table, slid and hit the floor. It shattered. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Dozens of glasses followed, their crystal stems snapping against the hard stone, a chorus of sharp, brittle pops. The investors stood frozen, their eyes darting from the dark screens to the empty air where their wealth had been seconds before. One man dropped his glass, the liquid splashing across his shoes as he stared at the ticker, now a void. The panic was not loud yet. It was a cold, creeping realization. The foundation of their empire had evaporated. The air in the room grew thin, charged with the sudden sharp scent of impending ruin. I stood up, and my knees popped with the dry, sharp sound of brittle wood. 3 years of crouching in a 12 by 12 concrete box had turned my joints into rusted hinges. I reached out to steady myself against the primary HVAC unit, the metal still humming with the dying vibrations of my servers. My fingers traced the rough, cold concrete of the wall, a surface I had memorized by touch in the absolute dark. I took a breath, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the stale, recycled scent of the ventilation shaft. My legs felt heavy, unaccustomed to the full weight of my own body. I looked back at the foam mattress, now just a pile of discarded industrial waste. I didn't feel relief. I felt a strange, hollow silence where the constant, low-frequency drone of the machines used to be. I turned toward the maintenance hatch, the small, circular portal that had been my only connection to the world above. I placed my hand on the rusted lever. The metal shrieked as the seal broke, a harsh, grating sound. I crawled toward the sliver of light waiting at the end of the shaft, leaving the darkness behind me. The hatch swung outward, and the sudden rush of unfiltered air hit my face like a physical blow. I pulled myself out of the alleyway, my boots hitting the pavement with a solid, definitive thud. The sunlight was blinding, a sharp contrast to the perpetual gloom of the vault. I stood in the narrow gap between buildings, shaking the dust of the HVAC unit from my shoulders. I reached into the hidden compartment of my pack and pulled out the garment I had spent months acquiring. I shed the tattered, grime-stained layer I had worn for years, letting it drop into the filth of the alley. Beneath it, the fabric of my new suit caught the sun, deep and flawless. I smoothed the lapels, feeling the weight and quality. I stepped out of the alley and onto the main thoroughfare. I looked toward the entrance, where the crowd had already begun to gather. The first siren cut through the air like a jagged blade, followed immediately by a chorus of wailing alarms that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. Black SUVs screeched onto the plaza, tires burning rubber against the pristine concrete. Federal agents swarmed out in a synchronized wave, their movements precise and aggressive. They didn't shout. They moved with the cold efficiency of a machine designed for one purpose. The crowd surged backward, pushed by the sheer force of the sudden, violent activity. I stood my ground, watching as the agents formed a perimeter, their heavy boots thudding in unison against the marble steps. The building was no longer a monument to corporate power, it was a crime scene. Blue and red lights strobed against the glass walls, turning the entire facade into a flickering, chaotic beacon of ruin. Every exit was blocked, every access point was secured. The city's ambient noise, the traffic, the chatter, the distant hum of daily life, was completely obliterated by the relentless, high-pitched scream of the sirens. I watched the lobby doors burst open as the lead team breached the interior. The empire was not just falling, it was being dismantled in real time, piece by agonizing piece. I moved through the sea of onlookers, my presence unnoticed by the panicked investors and frantic reporters. They were looking at the building, but I was looking at the man behind the glass. I stopped at the very edge of the police tape, the fabric of my suit crisp and immaculate against the backdrop of the crumbling empire. Marcus Thorne stood near the lobby entrance, his face pressed against the interior glass. He was searching for a face in the crowd, his eyes darting wildly until they locked onto mine. The arrogance that had defined his posture for 12 years vanished, replaced by a hollow, trembling realization. I did not look away. I held his gaze, letting the silence between us stretch until it felt heavier than the building itself. I stepped forward, ignoring the barrier, and leaned in close enough that he could read the intent in my eyes. I walked until the sirens were nothing more than a rhythmic pulse in the distance. The city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the collapse of a titan. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old, scratched key card, the one that had granted me entry into the dark, damp belly of the beast 3 years ago. I held it for a heartbeat, feeling the weight of the plastic, then dropped it into a storm drain. It clattered against the metal grate before vanishing into the subterranean flow. My hands felt light. The constant hum of servers and the smell of ozone were gone, replaced by the crisp, neutral air of the afternoon. I crossed the street, blending into the flow of pedestrians who had no idea that their world had just been rewritten. I did not check my phone for updates. I did not look back to see the black SUVs or the flashing lights. The work was finished. The debt was settled. I kept walking, my pace steady and unhurried, moving toward a horizon that finally belonged to no one but myself. The shadow of the building shrank behind me until it was just another silhouette. I was a ghost again, but this time, I was the one who had chosen to vanish. The park was empty, save for a few pigeons scattering as I approached the stone bench. From this vantage point, the city looked like a circuit board, its sprawling grid pulsing with the same electricity I had spent years manipulating. I watched the lights. In the distance, the Thorne Tech Tower stood dark, a jagged tooth against the darkening sky. The power surge I triggered had tripped breakers across 3 city blocks, leaving a trail of blackouts that mirrored the void I had left in Marcus's life. I sat down and rested my hands on my knees. My joints no longer ached with the dampness of the vault. The air here smelled of cut grass and cooling pavement, a sharp contrast to the static-heavy atmosphere of my former cage. I pulled a small blank notebook from my pocket, opened it to the first page, and watched the horizon. The sun was sinking, pulling the last of the daylight into the earth. I had no more code to write. For the first time, the silence was just silence. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, sharp shadows across the park path. I stood up, my movements fluid and unburdened. I left the notebook on the bench, its pages blank, a testament to a life I no longer needed to record. It would be found by a stranger, or perhaps it would be swept away by the morning rain. It no longer mattered. I stepped out of the park and onto the main thoroughfare, where the noise of the city returned in a dull, constant roar. I did not check my reflection in the shop windows. I did not look for news headlines on the digital kiosks. I walked past the subway entrance, toward the train station. My stride was measured, purposeful, and entirely unremarkable. The air grew colder as the night deepened, but I felt no chill. I reached the platform just as the train pulled in. I stepped inside and watched the platform slide away. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold, then vanished into the darkness. The train slowed as it moved beyond the reach of the city's electric hum. Outside, the concrete landscape gave way to open fields. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone, the last link to the network I had built. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the plastic and the cold glass screen. I didn't hesitate. I dropped it into the waste bin near the sliding doors and watched it disappear under a pile of discarded newspapers. The train came to a complete stop at a small, unmanned platform. I stepped out onto the gravel, the silence of the countryside pressing against my ears. There were no sirens here, no flashing tickers, no ghosts of Thorne Tech. I walked toward the gravel road that stretched toward the horizon. The sun began to break over the ridge, casting long, golden light across the tall grass. I reached the edge of the station and did not look back. I was no longer an architect of vengeance. I was simply a man walking into the morning, finally existing in a world that demanded nothing of me. The gravel road narrowed until it became little more than a dirt track winding through the trees. I stopped by a wooden fence, the wood weathered and silvered by decades of rain. I unbuckled the watch from my wrist, the last piece of precision engineering I owned, and set it on a fence post. It ticked for a moment, a tiny mechanical heartbeat in the vastness of the woods, then fell silent. I walked on. The trees grew thicker, their branches knitting together overhead to form a canopy of deep green. The air here smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and a sharp, clean scent of coming rain. I found a stream, its water clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones with a constant, low rush. I knelt and splashed my face, the shock of the cold grounding me in the present. There was no data to track, no servers to monitor, no empire to dismantle, only the wind moving through the leaves and the steady rhythm of my own breath. I stood and followed the stream deeper into the valley, away from the road, away from the memory of the city. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of my neck. I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley of rolling hills. I was finally, completely off the grid. The ridge offered a view that stretched for miles, a tapestry of forest and shadow. I climbed the final incline, my muscles burning with the exertion of the day. At the summit, I found a small stone structure, its roof long collapsed, reclaimed by moss and creeping vines. It was a relic of a different time, a place built by hands that knew nothing of circuits or code. I stepped inside, the stone walls cool against my palms. I sat on the dirt floor, leaning back against the rough masonry. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. I watched the light fade from the valley floor, the darkness rising to meet the trees. There was no hum of electricity here, no flicker of screens, no demand for efficiency. The world was vast, indifferent, and quiet. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind whistling through the gaps in the stones. For the first time in 15 years, I did not think about the next move, the next hack, or the next consequence. I simply existed in the cooling air. The night arrived, absolute and star-filled. I remained still, a shadow among shadows, finally untethered from the machine. The silence was not empty, it was complete. The stars emerged, sharp and cold against the black expanse of the sky. I pulled a single wooden match from my pocket, the last remnant of the world I had left behind. I struck it against the stone wall. The flare of yellow light was blinding, casting long, dancing shadows against the mossy masonry. I held the flame until it reached my fingertips, then dropped it onto a small pile of dry twigs I had gathered earlier. The wood caught, crackling softly, a sound that felt like a heartbeat in the stillness. I watched the fire grow, the heat radiating against my face, pushing back the encroaching chill of the mountain night. The smoke rose, curling up toward the open roof and disappearing into the vast, indifferent dark. My hands, once used to typing lines of code, now moved only to feed the small, honest flame. The weight of the past had dissolved. I was finally, irrevocably, free. If this story reminded you that the real power was never in the spotlight, it was always in the work. Please like and subscribe to Midnight Confessions. We tell the stories of those who were underestimated and came back stronger. The quiet ones are always watching, and we never forget.